My parents kicked me out of the house because I refused to give my savings to my golden sister, so they wanted to lure money from me, and then my name's Mason, and to say that my life has been a bit of a roller coaster these past couple of years would be an understatement. It all started back in 2020, when the pandemic hit and everything went sideways for my family. My dad, a hardworking and hopeful man, had just started a small business. He poured everything into it, all our savings, every last penny we had. He believed it was going to be the breakthrough we needed to finally live comfortably. But no one saw COVID coming, and the world shutting down crushed his dreams faster than anyone could have predicted. The business didn't stand a chance. It limped along for a while, but by 2021, it was barely holding on. Meanwhile, my mom didn't work. She hadn't for years, ever since she chose to stay home and raise my sister, Evelyn, and me. They thought it would be temporary, that my dad's business would take off and we'd be fine. But that never happened. We started to feel the financial strain almost immediately, and by the end of that year, things were bad. Really bad. I remember the moment when it all became real for me. It was a cold day in February, just after my 17th birthday. My parents sat Evelyn and me down at the kitchen table. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I could already tell something was wrong, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. My dad, looking tired and defeated, said, "We're going to have to start making some serious changes." He told us that once we hit 18, we were going to have to fend for ourselves. Not because they wanted to cut us off or anything, but because they simply wouldn't be able to support us anymore. My mom needed to focus on her own future now, on retirement, because they were running out of time to secure their own financial stability. I was still in high school at the time, but I'd already been working at a local diner since I was 16, trying to save up whatever I could for college. I knew I couldn't rely on my parents for tuition, not after how things were going. I had a plan, though. I'd save what I could, take out a student loan, and somehow make it work. It was stressful, but at least I knew what I was up against. Evelyn, on the other hand, was a different story. She was 4 years older than me, and at 22, had just finished college. Unlike me, though, she hadn't worked a single day during her studies. My parents had managed to scrape together enough to cover her expenses while she was at school, but now that she was out, the safety net was gone. She wanted to move in with her friends into a house downtown, but she didn't have enough money to cover her share of the rent. It wasn't exactly a shock to me. She had always been a bit more sheltered, I guess you could say. My parents coddled her, and she never really had to face the harsh realities of life the way I did. Then came the moment that turned everything upside down. Evelyn didn't come to me herself. Of course, she wouldn't. Instead, my parents asked me, point blank, if I would take some of my savings for school and give it to her, just enough to help her with the deposit and the first couple of months of rent. They promised me that Evelyn would pay me back, but I wasn't born yesterday. I knew how these things worked. "We're family," they said. "You should help each other out." But I couldn't. My college fund was barely enough to get me through the first year, even with loans, and I had busted my ass working late shifts and weekends to save every dime. If I gave her that money, I knew I'd be in trouble down the line. I couldn't risk my education, my future, just to bail her out of a mess that she should have been responsible for in the first place. So, I said no. That's when the fireworks started. My parents couldn't believe it. They were furious, and suddenly I was the bad guy, the selfish one. They said I was abandoning my sister, that family should come first, and that I was letting them down. The part that hurt the most was when they started throwing around threats. My dad, who had always been the voice of reason, looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you're not willing to help your family, then maybe you don't belong in this family." That hit me like a ton of bricks. They were really threatening to kick me out over this. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had always been the one who followed the rules, the one who worked hard and did what was expected of me, and now I was the one they were pushing away. All because I wanted to protect my future. The unfairness of it all made me so angry, but more than that, I felt betrayed. I thought my parents would understand, but clearly, I was wrong. So, I left. I packed a bag and walked out, not knowing where I was going or what I was going to do. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house, not with the way they had turned on me. I felt like I didn't matter to them anymore, like I was just an afterthought compared to my sister. It was as if all the sacrifices I had made didn't count for anything, simply because I wasn't willing to sacrifice more. I didn't have much saved up, but it was enough to get by for a little while. I ended up crashing with a friend, hoping that this fight with my parents would blow over, that they'd come around and realize how unfair they had been. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and I never heard from them. The silence was deafening, and it became clear that they had chosen Evelyn over me. They were more concerned about her rent than my education, and that was something I couldn't forgive. I had to grow up fast after that. I kept working, harder than ever, determined to make it through school on my own. There were moments when I felt like I was drowning, like the weight of everything was too much to bear, but I pushed through. I didn't have any other choice. After I left home, it felt like the whole world turned upside down. My decision to walk out and leave behind everything familiar wasn't something I had planned. In the heat of the moment, it felt like the only choice I had. But once the dust settled, reality hit me like a freight train. I didn't have much, just a duffel bag with some clothes and a few $100s saved from work. I had nowhere to go and no real plan, but I refused to stay in that house where I felt like a second-class citizen to my own family. I reached out to my Uncle Ben and Aunt Lisa. They were my dad's brother and his wife, and they had always been more like friends to me than distant relatives. I wasn't sure how they'd react to me showing up on their doorstep, but at this point, I didn't have many options. To my relief, they welcomed me in without question, letting me stay in their guest room. I could tell they felt sorry for me, but they didn't push me to talk about what had happened right away. For the first few days, they just let me exist in their house, giving me the space to figure things out. Of course, the story I told them eventually came out, though I left out some of the messier details about how ugly the fight with my parents had gotten. They were shocked, especially by the part where my parents had essentially kicked me out for refusing to bail out my sister. Uncle Ben seemed to be the most outraged, saying that my parents were being unfair, trying to shift the financial burden onto me. Aunt Lisa was more diplomatic about it, though I could tell she felt the same way. They kept telling me that my parents would come around, that they'd realize their mistake and reach out to me. But honestly, I wasn't so sure. It felt like my parents had made their choice, and they had chosen Evelyn. While I was grateful to my aunt and uncle, I couldn't shake the anger that festered inside me. It wasn't just about the fight or being kicked out. It was the deeper betrayal. My parents had hidden the reality of our financial situation from everyone, including themselves, for far too long. I knew things were bad for a while, but we weren't allowed to talk about it. To the outside world, our friends, our neighbors, we were still the family that had it all together. They didn't know about the struggles behind closed doors, the mounting debt, and the countless bills piling up in the kitchen drawer. My parents went to great lengths to keep up appearances, pretending that everything was fine even when we were barely holding it together. They didn't want to admit that my dad's business had failed, that we were struggling to make ends meet. Evelyn, too, was part of this charade. She didn't want her friends to know she was financially strapped after graduation. They were all moving into a nice place downtown, splitting the rent, going out to brunch on the weekends, living their Instagram-worthy lives. She didn't want to be the odd one out, the girl who had to ask for help or admit that she couldn't afford her share. I guess that's why the whole situation with her had blown up the way it did. She couldn't handle being vulnerable, couldn't admit that she wasn't able to keep up with her friends. Instead, she leaned on my parents, and then they tried to lean on me. And when I refused, they turned on me. That's what hurt the most, that they would rather maintain the illusion of a perfect family than support me in trying to build a future for myself. I spent days stewing in my anger. I couldn't stop replaying the argument with my parents in my head, over and over. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I wanted to hurt them like they had hurt me. I wanted them to feel the same shame and humiliation I'd felt when they made me out to be the villain in front of Evelyn. That's when I did something impulsive. One night, after I had a few drinks with some friends, I logged onto social media and wrote a long, detailed post about everything that had gone down. I didn't hold back. I told everyone about the financial difficulties we had been hiding for years, about how my parents had kicked me out because I wouldn't give my sister the money I'd saved for my own education. I spilled everything, the failed business, the debt, and how my parents had basically chosen to support Evelyn at my expense. It was cathartic in the moment, Like I was finally getting my side of the story out there after being silenced for so long. I wasn't thinking about the consequences, just the satisfaction of letting people see the cracks in the perfect image my parents had worked so hard to maintain. The post took off. People from my hometown started commenting, some offering support, others expressing shock at the truth behind the facade my family had kept up for so long. A few of my parents' friends even reached out to me privately, asking if I was okay, saying they had no idea things were so bad. The post became the talk of our little community, and before I knew it, my phone was blowing up with messages. As expected, my parents saw the post. It didn't take long for the angry texts and phone calls to start flooding in. My mom sent me a string of messages, calling me selfish, accusing me of airing out our private business and humiliating them. My dad was less emotional, but still furious. He told me I had no right to share our family's struggles with the world and that I had ruined their reputation. They weren't just mad, they were hurt. And I guess, in a way, I knew that was going to happen. But that didn't make it any easier to deal with when it actually happened. What surprised me the most, though, was when my mom called me in tears a few days later. She was crying so hard. I could barely understand her at first, but eventually, the words started to make sense. She wasn't just upset about the post. She was upset about the backlash they had received from our extended family. My grandparents, my aunts, my cousins, everyone had seen the post, and they had reached out to my parents, expressing their disappointment in how they had treated me. They couldn't believe that my parents had tried to pressure me into giving up my savings for Evelyn, knowing how hard I had worked for it. Suddenly, it wasn't just about my parents being mad at me. It was about them being under pressure from the rest of the family. And I think that's what really broke my mom. She wasn't used to being the one under scrutiny. She had always been the one keeping everything together, managing appearances. But now, people were judging her, and she couldn't handle it. She begged me to delete the post. She said that it was tearing the family apart, that people were turning against them, and that they were losing respect from everyone. My dad hadn't spoken to his own brother, Uncle Ben, in days, and my mom couldn't face my grandparents without feeling like a failure. She kept saying, "This is all my fault," over and over, like she was trapped in some nightmare she couldn't escape. In that moment, I didn't know what to feel. Part of me felt bad for her, seeing how much pain this was causing. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt and cast aside, couldn't help but think, this is what happens when you put appearances above your own kids. After that phone call with my mom, something shifted inside me. It wasn't like everything changed overnight, but the guilt started creeping in slowly, like a weight settling on my chest. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that what I did was justified, that they had pushed me to that point by treating me unfairly. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I had done the right thing, that heavy feeling of guilt wouldn't go away. My mom's words kept replaying in my head, especially when she reminded me how they had supported Evelyn and me all those years. And the truth was, she wasn't wrong. For most of my life, we were comfortable, not wealthy, but stable. My parents always made sure we had what we needed, and we never went without the basics. I had a decent childhood, and up until a couple of years ago, there was never any doubt in my mind that my parents were doing their best for us. But what stuck with me wasn't just the guilt about the past. It was the realization that, despite everything, I had publicly aired our family's dirty laundry. I had exposed their financial struggles to everyone in our social circle, something they had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. And in doing that, I hadn't just hurt them, I had humiliated them. That wasn't something I could ignore, no matter how justified I felt at the time. I knew my mom was right in that sense. I hadn't considered how much it would hurt them for the world to see that we weren't the perfect family they had always tried to present. The post caused way more of a stir than I'd expected. A lot of people commented, and I got messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, offering vague words of support. Some of my relatives reached out, saying they were on my side, that they understood why I was upset, and that I had every right to stand up for myself. But it wasn't the kind of support that made a difference. It felt more like they were just stirring the pot, enjoying the drama rather than really caring about what had happened. No one actually offered me real help. No one said, "Hey, Mason, let's talk about what you're going through," or "Do you need anything?" It was all surface-level support, and that became clear pretty quickly. In the end, I was still on my own, and my parents' reputation had taken a serious hit. The more I thought about it, the less satisfying it felt. Sure, I had gotten some validation from people saying they understood my side, but it didn't solve anything. It didn't make me feel better. Then there was the situation with my uncle and aunt. They had taken me in without hesitation, and now, because of my post, I felt like I had betrayed their trust. I hadn't talked to them before publishing it, hadn't considered how it might affect them. My Uncle Ben was furious when he first saw it. He didn't say anything to me directly, but I could feel the tension in the house. Aunt Lisa was more subtle, but she also seemed disappointed. It felt like I had burned the one bridge I still had left. I felt guilty about how I had handled things with them. They had been my lifeline when I had nowhere else to go, and I had repaid them by dragging the family drama out into the open, making everything worse. After a few days of trying to avoid them, I finally mustered the courage to apologize. I told them how sorry I was for not consulting them before I acted, how I hadn't thought about how it would affect them. It wasn't an easy conversation, and I could tell they were still upset, but they understood. Uncle Ben, though he disagreed with the way I had gone about it, told me that he could see where I was coming from. Aunt Lisa was the same. They didn't condone what I did, but they didn't hold it against me either. That helped, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I had damaged something important between us. And then there was Evelyn. The tension between us had been simmering for years, long before this fight about the rent money. We were never close, not like how some siblings are. Growing up, it always felt like we were living parallel lives rather than sharing one. She had her friends, her activities, and I had mine. We didn't argue much, but there wasn't much affection between us either. So when she asked for help through our parents instead of coming to me directly, it didn't surprise me. It annoyed me, but it didn't surprise me. The whole situation made me uncomfortable from the start. If she had just talked to me, maybe things would have been different. Maybe we could have worked something out, or at least had a conversation. But the fact that she went through our parents felt manipulative, like she didn't even respect me enough to ask for help herself. And then when I said no, she let them fight the battle for her. It was hard not to feel like I was being ganged up on. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that she didn't even try to deal with it on her own. It made me realize just how different we were. After a few weeks of stewing in all these emotions, guilt, anger, frustration, I finally made a decision. I deleted the post. It wasn't an easy choice, especially because a part of me still felt like I had been justified in writing it. But I realized that keeping it up wasn't doing me any favors. The satisfaction I had felt at first, the small victory of getting back at my parents, had faded. In its place was a deeper understanding that I wasn't really winning anything. All I had done was create more distance between myself and my family, and that wasn't something I could live with. After taking the post down, I talked to Uncle Ben and Aunt Lisa again. I explained everything, my motives, my regrets, how I had acted impulsively because I was hurt. They listened, and though I could tell they were still disappointed in how everything had unfolded, they forgave me. They knew I was in a tough spot, and even if they didn't agree with the way I had handled it, they understood why I felt the way I did. Things with my parents, on the other hand, were still rocky. The damage had been done, and I wasn't sure how to fix it. I hadn't spoken to my dad since the post went up, and my mom's tearful phone call was the last real conversation we'd had. I wasn't ready to reach out yet, and I wasn't sure they were either. I didn't know if they would ever understand why I had felt the need to stand up for myself the way I did. As for Evelyn, well, our relationship was as strained as ever. We hadn't spoken directly since the whole mess started, and I wasn't sure if we ever would. It was hard to imagine us ever being close after everything that had happened. There was too much history between us, too many unspoken resentments and misunderstandings. Maybe someday we'd find a way to talk about it, but for now, it felt like that was a bridge that might never be rebuilt. In the end, I realized that while I had won a small victory by standing up for myself, the cost had been higher than I'd expected. I had strained my relationship with my parents, my sister, and even my aunt and uncle. The superficial support I had gotten from people online wasn't worth it. What mattered more were the real, tangible relationships I had with the people who had been there for me. And that's why I chose to take down the post and start trying to mend the damage I had caused. It wasn't going to be easy. My family was fractured, and the scars from this fight would be with us for a long time. But I knew that if I didn't at least try to fix things, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. After I deleted the post and tried to rebuild my life, I thought things would slowly return to some kind of normal. I had made peace with my aunt and uncle, and though my relationship with my parents was still fractured, I figured that maybe in time things would cool off. But, as it turns out, the story wasn't quite finished. What came next blindsided me in a way I didn't expect. It all started during a casual conversation with my Uncle Ben. We had been sitting on the porch one evening, and he brought up something that caught me completely off guard. He mentioned how my sister, Evelyn, had borrowed money from him and Aunt Lisa to cover her rent a few weeks before the whole conflict with my parents exploded. I was stunned. It didn't make sense. If she had already borrowed money from them, why had my parents come to me, demanding I give up my savings to help her? The whole thing felt off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on behind the scenes. That conversation sparked a suspicion in me that I couldn't ignore. Why hadn't anyone told me about this before? Why had my parents acted like I was Evelyn's only option for help? I couldn't wrap my head around it. It didn't add up. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I needed to talk to Evelyn directly. We hadn't spoken since the argument, and honestly, I wasn't even sure she wanted to talk to me. But I had to find out what was really going on. I called her up, not really knowing what to expect. When she picked up, her voice was neutral, almost guarded, like she wasn't sure what I wanted. I didn't waste time with small talk. I laid it all out on the table. The fact that I knew she had borrowed money from Uncle Ben and Aunt Lisa, and that I was confused about why our parents had come to me for help when she had already gotten money elsewhere. At first, Evelyn sounded confused, like she didn't understand what I was talking about. But as we kept talking, the pieces started to fall into place. She told me that she had asked our parents for help after one of her friends backed out of the house they were supposed to rent. That last-minute change left her and the remaining roommates with a bigger chunk of rent to cover, and she had panicked. She hadn't asked me for money because, in her mind, it wasn't my problem. She figured our parents could help her out, even though things had been tight financially. But what she didn't know was that they had twisted the story when they came to me. It became clear during that conversation that our parents had manipulated the situation. They hadn't wanted to give Evelyn the money themselves, likely because they were already struggling and didn't want to dip into their own dwindling savings. So instead, they had come to me, pretending that she had asked me for help, not them. I couldn't believe it. The whole time, I had thought Evelyn was the one trying to take advantage of me, when in reality, she had no idea our parents had even approached me. That conversation with Evelyn changed everything. For the first time in years, we were talking, really talking. We started to open up about all the things that had gone unsaid between us for so long. She admitted that she hadn't been the best sister in the past, and she hadn't realized how much her actions had affected me. She had always been the one our parents doted on, and she knew that, but she had never considered how it must have felt for me to be the one always left to figure things out on my own. It was the first time she had ever really acknowledged the rift between us, and hearing her say that was like a weight lifting off my chest. We kept talking for hours, going over everything. Our childhood, our parents, the way things had fallen apart between us over the years. I could hear the regret in her voice, and I knew she meant it when she said she wanted to work on our relationship. It wasn't going to be easy, and I wasn't naive enough to think that one conversation would fix everything. But it was a start. For the first time, I felt like we were on the same page, and that maybe, just maybe, we could move forward and put the past behind us. But while my relationship with Evelyn was slowly starting to mend, things with our parents were another story. After Evelyn and I uncovered the truth, the already fragile relationship we had with them became even more strained. Evelyn confronted them about everything. How they had manipulated the situation, how they had pitted us against each other. The conversation didn't go well. My parents were defensive, angry even, refusing to admit that they had done anything wrong. They doubled down, insisting that they had been trying to help both of us, but it was clear that they were more concerned about protecting themselves than about the damage they had caused. Evelyn was done. She stopped talking to them entirely after that confrontation. It was a clean break for her, and I couldn't blame her. After everything that had happened, it was hard to see our parents in the same light. They had lied, manipulated us, and torn our family apart. all to avoid taking responsibility for their own financial situation. I didn't have the energy to keep fighting them, and neither did she. For the first time in my life, Evelyn and I were on the same side. We started supporting each other in ways we never had before. It wasn't perfect, and we still had our differences, but there was a sense of solidarity between us that hadn't existed before. We had both been let down by the same people, and that shared experience brought us closer together. As for my parents, I stopped expecting them to reach out. After everything, it became clear that they weren't ready to take responsibility for their actions, and I wasn't going to wait around for an apology that might never come. It was hard, letting go of the idea that we could fix things, but I had to focus on my own life now. College started not long after all of this went down, and honestly, it felt like a fresh start. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make the most of the opportunity one had worked so hard for. I had to take out student loans, of course, but I had saved enough to cover a good portion of my expenses. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life, like I was building something for myself without the weight of my family's dysfunction hanging over me. I didn't miss my parents as much as I thought I would. There were moments, sure, when I thought about what things might have been like if our relationship hadn't fallen apart. But those moments were rare, and as time went on, I found myself less and less concerned about reconnecting with them. I had Evelyn now, and though our relationship was still a work in progress, it was better than it had ever been. We kept in touch, checking in on each other, making sure the other was doing okay. It was strange how all of this had brought us closer in the end, but I was grateful for it. I wasn't ruling out the possibility of reconciling with my parents someday. Maybe in the future, things would change. Maybe they would realize what they had done, or maybe I would feel ready to reach out. But for now, I was content to leave things as they were. I had spent too long trying to make things work with people who weren't willing to meet me halfway, and I wasn't going to put myself through that again. This was the start of a new chapter for me. I was in college, doing what I had set out to do, and for the first time in a long time, I felt happy, truly happy. I had my sister by my side. I had my own future to look forward to, and I didn't need my parents to validate any of that. For now, that was enough. If you like the story, don't hesitate to subscribe and listen to new stories every day. Write in the comments what you like the most.